There are some incredible humans on planet Earth, and Dr. Shoshana Shendelman is one of them. Dr. Shendelman is a PhD in cellular, molecular, and biophysical studies and has committed her professional career to tackling some of medicine's toughest challenges, curing rare and underserved diseases.
By putting together a group of physicians and scientists that have different skill sets, different ways of thinking, and then if you layer in some of the technological advancements like AI, this should be a solvable problem.
Dr. Shendelman sits on Columbia University's Board of Trustees and is vice chair of its medical board. She also IPO'd her company, Applied Therapeutics, which eventually exceeded $1 billion market cap. But sometimes life takes unexpected turns. We can all relate. Applied Therapeutics and Dr. Shendelman's important research and development surrounding treatments for 3 diseases became entangled in an FDA procedural technical issue.
It's a horrible experience. It just really sort of threw me to the floor. I was surprised that, number one, somebody would do something like that. Number two, that it could have such a big impact and really sort of tear down a lot of what I had built.
Thank you, Dr. Shendelman, for joining me on Some Future Day to share your inspirational journey across the business of biotech, academia, and family. Dr. Shoshana Shendelman, thank you for joining me on Some Future Day.
Thank you for having me, Marc.
This is great. This is great. So your background is so interesting. Your family is from Iran, and at some point, it was really your father and your mother who, I think after the revolution, ended up coming to the States, but your father was already working in the States.
Correct. So my family is Persian. We're Persian Jews. And some of my family had already come to the United States before the revolution. The rest of my family essentially escaped just before or during the revolution. But my father was already here because he was part of a small group of Iranian scientists that were being trained at MIT in nuclear engineering and nuclear physics. Because now we think of Iran as a hostile government and not a friend of the U.S., but at that time, the Shah was in power, and it was a very different situation. It was a friendly country to the U.S. And so the United States was training nuclear scientists here at MIT to eventually return to Iran. And during that time, the revolution happened. My father was lucky enough to be able to just stay here in the United States. And so my sisters and I grew up here. I was actually the first person in my family born in the U.S. As compared to Iran. So
at the time of the revolution, was your father in Boston at that point in time? And with the rest of your family, your mother and your siblings?
So I was born in 1978, which is the year of the revolution, and I was born in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm the oldest, so all my sisters came after me. But I do have family members. One of my cousins in particular was actually at Pahlavi University when the revolution happened and watched her classmates literally be gunned down by machine guns. She's written a book about it, but there were some very scary experiences, but we were fortunate enough to already be in the U.S. at the time.
That's interesting. So your father's career path is relevant to what's happening in today's politics. It's interesting because President Trump right now is allegedly negotiating directly with Iran regarding their nuclear capabilities. What do you think about it?
So my father now works for the U.S. government, so he's not allowed to talk about any of the work that he does, which is actually a funny way.
Right? We don't want him
right, but that's a funny way to grow up, right? Like not necessarily, knowing, where he was or what he's working on. But obviously, I mean, it's a level of security and confidentiality that goes beyond anything that, we can imagine in normal life.
Do you think the Trump administration would be willing to provide Iran with nuclear capabilities for energy purposes?
I don't know enough about this topic. I am a scientist, but I'm not a nuclear scientist.
Mm-hmm.
But my understanding, just based on the level of physics that I've taken, is that it's not a very big leap between nuclear facilities for power purposes as compared to transitioning to nuclear facilities for weapons purposes.
Yeah, I think the news that's coming out today and yesterday with regards to Trump being flexible on that front is nonsense. I personally believe that the American and Israeli governments are leaking it to give Iran the feel that they have some sort of an advantage or some sort of flexibility. But I can't imagine that America and Israel will permit any nuclear energy because of the issue that you raised go into Iran. And furthermore, remember before October 7th, Saudi was about to join the Abraham Accords. And one of the key issues as it related to the Abraham Accords was that Saudi had nuclear energy capabilities, right? So all of a sudden Iran will, but Saudi won't. There's no way that's happening in that region.
You're probably right, but it's way beyond my area of expertise. I'm one of those people that I know what I know, and I'm also very aware of what I don't know. So I can talk to you forever about science and medicine and healthcare, but I'm probably not the best person to answer political questions.
So let's get into it. Let's talk about it. So your career path is super compelling, very interesting, but it's complicated, right? People think that all of a sudden you become a massive CEO and so qualified to find cures for diseases, underserved diseases and rare diseases, but it's not easy. So you're raised in the Boston area. Your father is working at MIT. How did you pick this career path? How did you get into medical school? What happened?
It's interesting. I do think that there's a bit of a genetic component behind whether you're interested and good at science. And in my family, there's definitely a thread there. We have a lot of doctors and scientists in our family. I was always drawn to science. Number one, I found that to be the most interesting subject always in school, but I also recognized that I was pretty good at science as well. So from a young age, I was drawn to science. I knew that I would do something in that field, but I didn't know exactly what. I remember being asked when I was 10 or 11 years old in school what I wanted to be when I grew up. And my answer was a marine biologist because I had just read a book called The Arm of the Starfish, which is actually about regeneration of nerves. And I didn't fall too far from that. I actually studied neurobiology as part of my PhD. So I always knew I wanted to do something in science. And then, of course, that evolved over time. You don't just decide when you're a child that you're going to be a biotech CEO.
So where did you go to medical school?
So I did my PhD in cellular and molecular and biophysical studies at Columbia Medical School. So Columbia actually has a PhD program that is within the medical campus itself that focuses more on aspects of science that are directly translational to diseases and understanding molecular mechanisms of disease, and then also how to potentially treat those diseases.
Is Columbia still best in class when it comes to that category of education?
I think so. That's why I chose to go there over 20 years ago, and I think they still are. I have two daughters who are actually undergraduates at Columbia, and I did encourage them to consider Columbia. They both are pre-med and plan to go to medical school. I will also encourage them to think about Columbia Medical School because I do believe that Columbia is really at the top.
So you mentioned that this scientific piece runs almost genetically or inherently within your family. Is it just your daughters? Is it just your daughters and your father? Like how wide is medicine within your family?
It's pretty wide. One of my other sisters was also a science major in college. She ended up going off the rails and studying law afterwards.
Oh, no.
But quite a few of my cousins are physicians, and my youngest sister, because I have four younger sisters. So one studied science and then went into law. The other one studied science and went straight through to medical school, and she's a surgeon.
Amazing. So your parents have to be so proud. I mean, you guys are the best family ever, right?
I'm pretty proud.
That's amazing. That's really great. So, okay, so you finish medical school, and then what happens? You go into like big companies, you go big in corporate, or what's
So
your
I
career
had
path?
an interesting experience.
Hmm.
I did my PhD in the 2001 to 2005 timeframe. And that was just when we were figuring out how to differentiate stem cells into other things. Now it's very well understood, and we could almost do it on my kitchen counter. But at the time, it was really a frontier of science and an evolving field. And so my PhD research was focused on Parkinson's disease and understanding the genetic causes of Parkinson's disease. A big piece of what I worked on was differentiating cells into dopamine neurons, which are affected in Parkinson's, and figuring out how to go from stem cells to neurons at that time was a big jump in technology. And so when I finished my PhD, I went into consulting specifically because that knowledge base was not very widespread. And that was really relevant for drugs and for technologies that were being brought into the biotech and pharmaceutical industry. So I went into consulting and started working on drug development in the pharmaceutical setting. I eventually started my own biotech company, and now I work with several biotech companies
So
getting drugs off the
just
ground.
going back to Parkinson's, like I know so many families still are just in terrible situations because of Parkinson's. So you're saying that leap with regards to stem cells was significant, but why is Parkinson's just? It seems like honestly, like I feel like I'm meeting more and more people who have family, relatives, friends, whoever it might be, with Parkinson's now. Is it becoming more and more prevalent? Is it? Are we attacking it the right way?
Well, I'll say a couple of interesting things on this topic.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it is becoming more prevalent, which is partly because people are living longer, because the incidence of Parkinson's disease from non-genetic causes increases as you age. So the longer people live, the more of them you'll have at later stages of their life that actually live long enough to develop Parkinson's disease. But there are also genetic causes. And the genetic causes of Parkinson's result in a much earlier onset form, which is, for example, in their 40s or 50s as compared to over the age of 65. But we also now understand that there are genetic factors that can influence or cause Parkinson's disease. The most commonly known is a pesticide that was used over a few decades, and that use of that pesticide or exposure to that pesticide in the agricultural industry was shown to result in Parkinson's disease in a number of people.
Wow, interesting. I feel like so many people that I know are like just on a regular basis popping up and saying, "Oh my God, my uncle has Parkinson's." Or if it's a genetically oriented disease, I know you're saying it's both genetic and non-genetic, but if it's genetically oriented and we have all of these advances in technology, like for example, AI and research of DNA, are doctors able to identify the causes at an earlier point of view? And are they trying to use medication now to suppress it somehow?
There are some Parkinson's drugs in clinical trials now. I think it is a place where we have an opportunity to really take leaps and bounds forward with new technology. What I worked on for my PhD, which took me about 4 years, I'm pretty sure AI could do in a number of months right now.
Wow.
So that really accelerates our ability to advance towards drugs. I'll tell you a funny side story. I was at one of these dinners for Columbia Medical School, and I was seated with a group of people that I didn't know previously, and we all started talking, a group of scientists and physicians. And at some point, the host of the dinner sort of came over and said, "So, have you guys solved Parkinson's disease yet?" And it turned out that it wasn't an accident that we were seated together. We were deliberately put
Oh, wow.
there because we had all worked on Parkinson's disease at some point in our careers. And it is a little bit unbelievable that there's still no effective drugs to
Yeah.
treat such a terrible disease that affects such a broad number of patients. And at first it seemed like an off the cuff statement. "So have you guys solved Parkinson's yet?" But then we all started thinking about it and wondered, why have we not solved this yet? And by putting together a group of physicians and scientists that have different skill sets, different ways of thinking, and then if you layer in some of the technological advancements like AI, this should be a solvable problem.
So if you take AI and unlock it then on all different types of medically related issues, what do you ultimately think will happen? Where do you think AI, as it relates to finding cures to diseases, whether it's rare, underserved, or even diseases that have, some available medication today, like where do you think AI is going to start hitting the most in the short term?
I think we're going to see targets identified much more quickly than we did before. So again, drawing this back to what did I work on that took me 4 years and,
Sure.
accelerating that. It takes scientists years in most cases to understand what the molecular pathways of a certain disease are, to understand what's happening here that's being derailed or that's sort of going away that it shouldn't, that's causing this disease. And only once we understand those molecular targets, then can we try to drug them. And one of the things that I've seen AI just advance at a speed that I never could have imagined is target identification, because there's so much information available on a genetic level and a molecular level, biomarkers, blood samples, things that would take a person years and years and years to try to draw lines and connect the dots. But AI can do that very quickly. And the first step is identifying what's the target that we need to hit. The second place is then drugging those targets.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're able to do now with AI is actually, once we have a potential target and we know we want to drug it, to look at what does that look like as compared to other known proteins or enzymes or receptors, and try to figure out way quicker than we ever could in the past what kinds of drugs, or even sometimes drugs that are already out there for other things, could be used to hit that target.
So how, like in the short term, how do you think we'll see AI change the way we are as it relates to the medical community?
I think we're going to see a huge acceleration of drug development. And we need to ensure that the rest of what happens after that keeps up with that pace. Because in the pharmaceutical industry, identifying a possible drug is just the first step, right? So we know the target, now we have a drug for it. What do you do next? Testing. Animal testing, in vitro testing in a test tube, and then testing in people, which is clinical trials. And that's a place where the procedures and policies right now for testing drugs are the same that they were 30 years ago. It's not moved forward at the speed that our technology and things like AI are moving forward. So I think the next place that we really need to see change, if we're going to keep up with our technological advancement, is on what we call the regulatory front. What do you do with those drugs to get them from a possible drug into an approved drug for patients?
So you're talking right now about the FDA.
FDA is a big piece of it.
Is there a state level of regulation that also needs to be updated?
I think that there's very different levels. So having access to drugs eventually in the commercial market comes from the FDA.
Yeah.
But before that, there's access to clinical trials. There's a lot of regulations around who can be in a clinical trial and under what circumstances. There are some more sort of localized aspects of driving that process forward, but the big deciding factor is the FDA here, and in Europe, the EMA.
So I'm seeing like a lot of issues popping up as it relates to artificial intelligence, creating advancements in different business sectors. But then for some reason or another, legislation can't keep up. Law enforcement in some cases can't keep up. So are you saying that the FDA is not in a position right now to basically keep up? Like its policies and procedures are so archaic that it won't be able to keep up with all of those incoming advancements in medicine?
I think that's true. I think that we probably should have started this process years ago and sort of foreseen some of these changes that needed to be made. Just fact-wise, the basic regulations at FDA for what you need to do to bring a drug through the development and approval process haven't been updated in 30 years. And I think we'd all argue that technology has advanced in 30 years.
Yeah, it's
so,
amazing.
you know,
Since the
we're overdue.
1990s, it's incredible.
Yeah, we're overdue for an update, but I do think that there's a potential to move quickly now and catch up. And that's really where we need to look to the future. It's easy to say, here's all the things that are terrible. Here are all the things people are doing wrong. But the important thing is, how are we going to fix it? And I think we have an opportunity in front of us to catch up quickly and change regulations to line up with where we are from a science and technology perspective.
But you're saying it takes too much time. Is that the key issue? Because isn't that time important as it relates to safeguarding innovation with regards to drugs and making sure that the users, the patients, are safe? Like, if we accelerate, isn't it dangerous?
There are obviously some things that could be dangerous if they were accelerated, and those should not be up for discussion. But I'll give you a real life example. So we recently heard from President Trump that monoclonal antibodies or biologic treatments that are antibodies as drugs are no longer going to be required to be tested in certain animals. We have to see that enforced. We need to see that regulation change. We need to see that move through the FDA. But that's a good example of where a policy didn't keep up with technology. So antibodies are what our immune system, develops against a target. We make antibodies as drugs, and there are a lot of drugs right now which are monoclonal antibodies. Testing a human monoclonal antibody in an animal doesn't make a lot of sense because the animals won't respond to it the same way that people would. It does make sense when there's what we call small molecule drugs or traditional drugs, compounds. That's what that regulatory pathway was built for originally. And then when we had monoclonal antibodies, or any antibodies actually, as drugs, the regulations weren't updated. So we were still doing this testing in animals that made no sense conceptually because animals wouldn't respond the same way as people to antibodies. So that's sort of a real life example of where we need change, and we are changing, but there's a lot more behind that. There's a lot more that needs to change.
I mean, it just seems totally ridiculous, honestly, just to put it bluntly. I mean, it's insane. And I think it's a good example where, once again, you have a governmental entity that is not as sophisticated as the private sector. And as a result, things are a little bit sluggish and hurt society. So if you're going to break down the FDA beyond this, how else do you think the FDA can be updated? What could we do to improve the process from start to finish for, good drugs to be approved to help patients, to help people?
I think AI is one place where we need to take a close look, and quickly, because we now have AI approaches and ways of looking at data that are actually not only faster, but more accurate than some of the traditional lab-based testing that we have been used to doing and are required to do through the current regulatory protocols. So really looking at where is AI actually a better assessment of patient safety and potentially efficacy versus the traditional in the lab, or in an animal setting, is an easy place to start. I think also a recognition of the importance of bringing drugs more quickly to patients and the urgency to treat. I think for a long time, and maybe to your point, because it's a government entity and sometimes there is this way of thinking in government entities, that it's very risk averse. Patient safety is, of course, the most important thing when you're developing drugs. A lot of patients, though, are facing fatal diseases. And so when you talk about patient safety in the context of somebody who's dying, it's a very different conversation. There has to be a risk-benefit balance. And I think that in some cases on the risk-benefit assessment, we've been worried about the risk without the context of what's the benefit. If it takes 10 years to develop a drug and bring it through the regulatory process, a lot of those patients have unfortunately already died.
Can you give me an example of any drug recently that the regulatory process slowed it down, and it should not have been slowed down? It should have been pushed through, but for the red tape, but for the bureaucracy of the FDA?
I had a personal experience with this just last year. We were developing a drug at my former company for a pediatric rare disease called galactosemia. This is a terrible rare disease that affects children. It causes permanent neurological damage, and there's no treatments available. So there's literally no options. There was nothing else in clinical trials. So our drug was the one opportunity. And I believe that we showed a very strong safety and efficacy profile. I met a lot of the children who actually had received the drug in our clinical trials after the fact. To be able to tie that benefit to actual children and actual families, it's really different than, analyzing things on paper and sort of looking at numbers. In this case, there was FDA bureaucracy about how data was transferred, through an electronic system handled in the clinical trial, which ultimately resulted in the drug not being approved. And there was a huge backlash from the patient community and the families, because to hear that a drug is not available to your child because of a bureaucracy element without there being any patient safety issues or any patient safety concerns is really heartbreaking.
So just so I understand, so the drug was not approved because of an electronic data mistake? Is that it? I'm trying to simplify it for the audience. Like, it wasn't the drug. It wasn't rejected based on the merits of the drug, based on the efficacy of the drug. It was disapproved based on the process. It was a procedural mistake
based on the data processing and handling procedures that, resulted in that efficacy data. But yes, very bureaucratic.
But did you have the data to back it up? Was the data there to back it up?
Yes. But there is a certain way that these things need to be handled from an FDA perspective. These regulations are hundreds and hundreds of pages, and they haven't necessarily kept up with the technology that we use in clinical trials. So in this case, we were using some specific electronic behavioral tests that hadn't been used in clinical trials before. So we worked with an expert firm to develop the process of how that electronic data should be captured and moved through in an FDA compliant manner. Again, hundreds and hundreds of pages of regulation. At the end of the day, it wasn't the way that the FDA wanted us to do it. And so the data that was generated in that way from the clinical trial was discarded.
So do you think the drug will ultimately be approved?
I do. I really believe in the drug and the science. I've seen the effect that it's had on these children, and it's safe and well tolerated. And so I do think that eventually this will win out and hopefully be available to patients and families. But I understand the urgency on their side. And, every year that goes by with these children, it's more permanent neurological damage happening. And that can't be recovered.
So right now, those patients, those families have no hope.
If they weren't in our clinical trials, they have no hope. We were able to continue providing the drug to any patients who were in our clinical trials. It's a very small number. It was about 50 patients out of 3,000 in the US. So if you're not one of those 50 patients, you have no hope right now.
So the FDA approves that. So the FDA is approving that those patients can continue to use the drug that it didn't approve.
Correct.
So how is that logical?
Approval is different from providing access, is probably what they would say. So one of the elements that can encourage patients to participate in clinical trials is saying after the trial is over, you can potentially have access to the drug in the period of time between the trial completion and approval, as long as the drug is safe.
I gotcha. So let's go back. Let's talk about your company a little bit. I mean, you were an incredible force. You built up this company. I learned in talking to you before today that it is really expensive to take a drug, take a concept, and bring it all the way through to approval. So let's talk about this drug specifically. You realized at some point, you have this company, you realize at some point that you need more money to get these drugs into the pipeline so that they can eventually be approved by the FDA. So how much is it typically these days in America? Like, how expensive is that process to get like one new drug approved?
It's hundreds of millions of dollars. Drugs for larger indications that require larger clinical trials, which is the majority of drugs that we see these days, cost hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes approaching $1 billion to get the drug approved, because there are a number of clinical trials required. And for drugs that are not for rare diseases, those clinical trials often need to include thousands of patients, sometimes in the order of 2,000 to 3,000 patients per trial, and you need 2 phase 3 trials. So we're talking about thousands of patients. Those trials cost hundreds of millions of dollars to run. In the case of rare diseases, it's somewhere in the ballpark of $50 to $100 million because there's smaller trials, there's less patients. In the case we were just speaking about, 3,000 patients in the United States. So you're talking about smaller trials that cost a little less. I think a lot of people would still argue that $50 million is a lot of money, though.
Ton of money, sure.
It's a lot. So the typical path that companies take, and this is what I've done as well, is to develop the earlier stages of a drug in a private company setting where you can raise tens of millions of dollars from private investors. When you get to the point of needing to run phase 3 trials, it's very difficult to do that in a private setting. I IPO'd my company for that reason, because in the public markets, you can raise a magnitude of capital that is beyond what you can raise in the private markets. And when you get to that stage of needing to run a $50 million trial or a $100 million trial, the place to do that is usually in the public markets.
Well, it's kind of interesting also because I would think that the big pharma companies don't want to play with these smaller drugs because it's not really scalable ultimately, right? It's a rare disease, but yet rare diseases are ubiquitous. I think you told me that there's 10% of the American population that are suffering from rare and underserved diseases today.
That's correct. There are 30 million people in the United States with a rare disease. The problem is that there are 7,000 different rare diseases. So it's not rare to have a rare disease. 10% of our population is walking around with a rare disease. Mm-hmm. But when you break it down to all of those 7,000 individual diseases, many have only a few thousand patients with that particular disease in this country. The technical definition is having less than 1 in every 200,000 patients with a disease in order for it to be designated as rare.
Right.
In many cases, though, it's an ultra rare disease.
Right. That's amazing, actually. So for you, you were inspired to go into the rare disease sector because you wanted to help these individuals? Or like, what was the impetus? Like, what clicked your emotions to get into that field?
I did, but my career wasn't always that way. So I think we were talking earlier about my PhD work was on Parkinson disease. That's a very large disease state. I've worked in multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis. Those are much larger disease indications, not rare. And as a scientist, I always heard about the numbers we just discussed. I knew there were 7,000 rare diseases. I knew that 95% of patients with a rare disease had no treatment options available. But I didn't really internalize what that meant until we had a family experience. And that really shaped my career and changed my perspective. So my cousin, who is a physician himself, Dr. Fred Noban, he was
Very
a
prominent physician, right?
prominent neurosurgeon, head of neurosurgery at Lenox Hill Hospital, in fact, and someone that I was very close to, a very meaningful person in my life, developed leukemia and was treated effectively for leukemia. But after that treatment with an immune system that wasn't working properly, he developed a multi-drug resistant infection. We hear about these often, right? We hear about the threat of antimicrobial resistance, but there are bacterial strains that are resistant to every antibiotic we know of.
Horrifying.
And unfortunately, he developed one of those infections, and there was nothing we could do. My family has a lot of doctors and scientists. We all tried everything we could, every treatment that we could possibly get globally. But unfortunately, nothing worked. Nothing was available. And ultimately, he passed away. But it was that experience of being told there's nothing we can do. There are no drugs available for this disease. Say your goodbyes. Is horrifying. And it really changed my perspective on drug development in general. And it transformed it from just statistics, numbers on a page, 95% of people with a rare disease have no treatment options available, to what is that actually like when that's your loved one that has the rare disease and there is nothing you can do. And so I shifted at that point and really decided to dedicate my career to developing drugs for rare and underserved diseases. So diseases that have no treatment options available or no really viable treatment.
So, I mean, that's like such heavy news, right? Especially for a family like yours that has so many resources, so many capabilities. What do families do when they hear this news? Like, where do they turn? What happens next? Like, where do they go for help?
We experienced it firsthand. It's horrifying. There's not a lot of places to turn is the unfortunate answer there. And I think some recent statistics showed that about 80% of patients and families that are faced with a rare disease diagnosis are unable to find specialists with that expertise that they need.
Mm-hmm.
Putting aside 95% of them have any drugs available or any treatment options. But even just finding the right people to even, diagnose or treat that illness is very difficult.
So you have this terrible experience. I'm so sorry. Like, I have to acknowledge it. I mean, it's heartbreaking. And then truly, I mean,
it was horrible.
It's like debilitating. I know it impacts you still today. I would imagine your whole family, of course. And then you start this company and you're building, you're growing. And then all of a sudden you decide that you're going to take it public. You're going to IPO Applied Therapeutics. What made you think that you could do that? That's like, it's amazing that you got to where you are as a woman, right? And then all of a sudden you're like, I'm going to go further. I'm going to Wall Street. What inspired you to do that? What made you think you can take this company and go public?
I think it was what needed to be done in order to get to the next stage. And I think, that's a way that I've viewed my career and my life. And I think there are a lot of people, especially women in science, who have had to overcome a lot to feel like, well, there's a hurdle, but I'm going to get over that hurdle. And so obviously it's not easy to IPO a company, but that's what I needed to do in order to get to the next stage of development, to be able to raise $50 million, $100 million for that phase 3 stage trial that we needed to do for our lead drug, and then a second drug after that. And it's not easy to IPO a company, but it's what had to be done. So I just, like everything else, and I think many of us are this way, look at the problem, how are we going to solve it, and then just step by step try to move through that problem.
So it's so impressive, right? You single-handedly took a company public. It's my understanding the company went to $1 billion market cap. Huge success. You have 2 new drugs in the marketplace that reach the 3rd phase of the process to be approved. How many, I mean, that's very rare too. That's an amazing success, an amazing accomplishment too. How many drugs ever make it to the 3rd phase?
only 10% of drugs make it to phase 3. So I think some of these numbers are really shocking to people, right? To find out that it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to get through phase 3 trials, and only 10% of drugs even make it to phase 3.
Correct.
But it's diseases, it's medicine. It's a place where we need to move forward and we need to advance. And so, it's worth the cost, and it's worth the effort, and it's worth the timeline, because in many cases we're saving people's lives or we're transforming their lives. And that's why the biotech and pharmaceutical industry, I think, is so important.
So you're deeply involved personally with regards to steering the progress of these two drugs. You're deeply involved personally with regards to running this company that has $1 billion market cap. And you are a very hands-on mom, right? I mean, like, you are like not missing any part of motherhood, right?
Correct. I'm very hands-on. I have 2 daughters. I think it is especially meaningful to me that I'm the oldest of 5 girls in my family. So I'm a girl's girl. I'm the oldest of 5 girls. I have 2 daughters. They're also science majors in college. They both go to Columbia. They're both planning to go to medical school. And I have been very hands-on with them from the start. Obviously, I love my children, but I do think that there's a lot that is even outside of academics that we learn from in life. So just as an example, I coached their softball team, a girls' softball league, starting when they were about 7 years old, straight through the league. And that time together, not only building the skill set, training, but I think it was also important for them to see me leading the softball team. So not just standing on the sidelines cheering for them, but coaching that team. It made a big difference.
Did you win?
We often won.
There you go. So,
and we often turned things around. So the number of times that I had to give a bunch of 10-year-old girls a speech of, we're down by 10 points, but we can turn this around, it's probably more than you'd imagine.
Did you ever stop while you're building these 3 columns and be like, I'm a young person. I've worked my butt off to do all of this, but look how proud I can be. Did you ever stop and realize at that moment you're really accomplishing so much? This is your life and look what you're doing. Did you ever have a moment to really enjoy it?
I probably haven't, but that's probably a fault. I think it's a lot of times easier to see that from the outside, whereas people from the inside that are trying to drive forward and be successful, both from a career perspective and a parenting perspective, I think are oftentimes, and this was certainly the case for me, always thinking about what else can I do? What can I do better? And what can I do next? And sometimes that holds you back from sort of looking at things and saying, wow, everything I've already done is an amazing accomplishment. And so that's something that I have a lot of self-recognition of. I do need to stop a little bit more. If you and I are talking about this right now, the fact that both of my daughters are science majors at Columbia, doing amazingly. They're straight A students. Hopefully they go on to medical school. I have a very close family. I'm extremely close with my sisters, my cousins, my aunts. I'm really very fortunate in life and also in my career to have founded a company, gone through an IPO, gotten 2 drugs through phase 3. But you don't always stop to notice that at the time.
I think it's a common trait for people that are builders, right? I often talk about the fact that the photographer Halsman mentioned there are builders and there are destroyers, and you're a builder, right? Clearly you're a builder. But what happens is builders sometimes feel alone. Even while you're accomplishing, you're not there celebrating your accomplishments. You just keep going and pushing forward and creating. And, in your case, you're trying to save humanity. You're trying to raise a family. You're trying to build value for Wall Street. Did you ever have those moments where you're like, oh, I am all alone?
I think you're right. It's very isolating in a lot of ways.
Right.
You are often the only person in that exact situation. It's unrelatable to a lot of people. It's an extreme amount of pressure.
Right.
And from from both the families that you're developing drugs for and also investors. I'm sure most industries are like that, not just biotech, but
For sure.
when you're the CEO of a company, and especially when you founded that company, there's not a lot of separation between you and the company's success. So it's a lot of pressure, but I do think, and it's sometimes isolating. But I do think that that's where, in my case, having a very supportive extended family and a lot of aunts, uncles, cousins, mostly women in my family. There's a lot of really successful women that couldn't understand exactly what I was going through, but provided a lot of generalized support that women can do amazing things and be successful on both the career and the family front, I think really helped to get me through.
So what happened when things went a little south? Like the two drugs at some point, because of this procedural issue that the FDA called out, they're not approved. And then all of a sudden there's like a hit piece in this like rag magazine. As I see it, it's like a gossipy magazine. And it's about you. You discover that there's this hit piece on you. You've been so committed your entire life, your entire career. You're trying to do the right thing for patients and families with rare diseases, for Wall Street and investors. And of course, while you're taking care of your children and your family, and then boom, all of a sudden this story comes out. What are you thinking?
I'll be honest, Marc, it was a horrible experience. I don't wish that on anyone. In my case, basically, aside from really, pressing salt in the wound, we had recently found out that our drug was not getting approved by the FDA. We received a complete response letter, CRL, and a warning letter on top of that. So it was really a low point, but ready to get back up there and sort of say, okay, let's fix the problems. Let's resubmit. Let's go talk to the FDA. Let's get this drug to patients. To sort of be taken down on a personal level as well. So in my case, the article was extremely personal. And it didn't just discuss me as a scientist or me as a CEO, but me as a person. When I had dedicated my career, for the last 10 years towards patients and families that have no other treatment options. And it's a horrible experience. It just really sort of threw me to the floor.
Yeah.
I was surprised that, number one, somebody would do something like that. But, number two, that it could have such a big impact and really sort of tear down a lot of what I had built.
Yeah, I understand that there's a routine with regards to that publication targeting other women, CEOs in particular, and then shorting stocks. And obviously what I'm saying is pure speculation, but we've done some research on our side and we've seen that there's a correlation between hit pieces coming from that magazine, specifically against female CEOs, stock prices being shorted, and hedge funds making money off of it. So, it's something also that's debilitating. And I think that issue is a recurring issue in the biotech space, right? Where articles are planted and then funds, hedge funds, and other speculators are shorting stocks and they're making millions and billions of dollars. And, it's kind of lousy given the fact that here you are trying to literally save people's lives. It's a difficult thing, but yet you still, you walked away with a ton of credibility, right? You moved on with you still have your position as you're on the board of trustees at Columbia. I mean, you're, without a doubt, still a pillar within the medical community.
It's true. I am really honored to be a trustee of Columbia University. I'm vice chair of the medical school board as well. And I have moved on to work on other drugs, help other companies, lead other companies through the drug development process. But you're right. It did take a toll, and it is very unfortunate that some people have chosen taking down female biotech CEOs as a business model. And, I think that makes it even harder for women to advance in science and biotech and the pharmaceutical
What would
industry.
you say to women whether they're in biotech or not, that need to overcome adversity. People like you who are builders, who are saving lives, but then all of a sudden get hit and all of a sudden life comes to a screeching halt just for a second. How would you inspire women in particular to realize that they could get through tough times?
I think there are some cliche statements that actually really resonate. Like they might be cliches.
I thought you were going to say, I'm being
true.
cliche.
No. I often think, especially my cousin Fairy that we were talking about earlier, who really inspired me to develop drugs for rare diseases, would often say things like, nothing worthwhile is ever easy.
True.
And if you want to do something important, it's going to be hard. And you just have to fight for it. And I think that there's a lot of cliches around that, but they're true. When I look at what I've been able to accomplish in my career, and when I look at the effect that that's had on my daughters and their friends, and some of the girls that I used to coach in softball who are also now in college, I have been able to affect change. It's not been easy, but there has been a positive result. And so I hope that with women or girls who are facing challenges, especially in male-dominated industries, it will not be easy, and we will have to work harder than anyone else. But we can overcome that and move everyone forward with us.
Well, it's kind of interesting because it's also who you are, right? You're not going to all of a sudden change because some guy, some weirdos hiding behind a keyboard is writing a poor story about you. And then all of a sudden you're going to shift careers. You're going to become a fashion designer or a filmmaker. Like you are,
wrong with fashion
designers. but you are a scientist. You are here to save lives, and you're never going to stop that. You're not going to pivot. And the fact that, Columbia University has, proven that they stand behind you like one of the most important institutions, notwithstanding everything that's going on that campus right now. I mean, it says a lot, right? You're not changing. This is who you are.
Yeah. It's funny you bring that up. A few years ago, there was a similar kind of attempt to target, what they would refer to as, quote, my credibility. And the attempt was, where did I even come from? And did I even really have a PhD from Columbia?
Ridiculous.
And, tweeted out and posted. And shortly afterwards, I was announced as a trustee of Columbia. And you pretty sure, right, that Columbia knows if I went to school there and the dates of my degrees.
Of course.
And so they chose the wrong element there to try to hit on credibility. But I think it's interesting that the attempt was made. And the number of people that asked if they could see my degree and could I prove that I had a PhD from Columbia on its own was shocking, because I can't imagine anyone asking that of a male CEO of a pharmaceutical company. So I think just that, level of someone tweeting out that they didn't believe that I had a PhD from Columbia, and then actual investors and others coming to me and saying, can you prove to me that you have a PhD from Columbia?
It's absurd.
Absurd. And then, of course, in that case, being announced as a trustee of Columbia put all of that to bed. But I think we need to look at things like that, with a similar lens of trying to take down women.
Do you think the world is getting a little bit better on that front? Like I know now you've been, approached by investors, you've been approached by other companies to put you into serious position, right? A way to lead publicly traded companies and beyond with some of the most important new medications as well. Do you think people shifted, or do you think it will always, that issue of, gender discrimination is always going to be there?
I think we're getting better, which is important, right? We have to establish progress forward. I see with my own daughters that what they're looking at as science majors in college now, working in labs, doing research, and, potentially going to medical school, it's really different from the way things were 25 years ago when I was in that setting. And so we have made progress. And while I wish that things were all the way there, where we needed them to be, where everything was, equal, and there was no gender bias on a professional level, I don't think we're there yet, but we're moving in that direction. So an interesting example is that the number of women in STEM is increasing. The number of female physicians, I think, is just at about 50% now.
That's what I've read.
That's progress. Those numbers were not so good, 10 years ago. But where there's still a gap is women in leadership positions. And so the number of female biotech and pharmaceutical CEOs is very low. The number of female CEOs of public pharmaceutical or biotech companies is a handful. A handful. And that's not okay. That's where we need to move in the next phase. So we're moving forward. Hopefully we'll find ways to catalyze that, to accelerate it and move forward more quickly. But at least we're not moving backwards. That's a plus.
Yeah. Shoshana, all of my guests end the show with me. They end the episode with me in the same way. Yeah. I give a leading question and it incorporates the name of the show, Some Future Day, and then they finish. Are you up for that with me today?
Yes, I'm up for it.
Okay. In some future day, American medicine will improve because the FDA will be radically changed by
taking a practical and forward-looking view of drug approvals that keeps up with the American advancement of science and technology.
Beautiful. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to our conversation?
Thank you for having me, Marc.
Thank you for being with me. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Some Future Day. I know your time is super valuable, so I hope you learned how you can leverage emerging technology to improve your life. And exciting news, my new book, Some Future Day, How AI is Going to Change Everything, is now available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, and other major booksellers across the globe. I am so proud to share that because of your support, the book topped the charts. It became #1 bestseller in cryptocurrency, #1 bestseller in artificial intelligence, and #1 bestseller in robotics. So, if you're curious and ready to learn how AI can enhance your career, your community, and your family, get yourself a copy today.